You're listening to Now I've Heard Everything, conversations with the icons of our time.
I went around the track once against Lyndon and won that. I went round then against Robert Kennedy, and that was a tie. And then we had to run against the party, so we had to tie different opponents every time we went around.
Former Democratic presidential candidate Eugene McCarthy. Today on Now I've Heard Everything, I'm Bill Thompson. The 2024 Democratic National Convention is taking place this week in Chicago. Now, back in 1968, Democrats also held their convention in Chicago, and that year, the incumbent president declined to run for re-election. Now, with Lyndon Johnson out of the picture, one of the leading candidates for the nomination that year was Minnesota Senator Eugene McCarthy. His anti-Vietnam War stance resonated with large numbers of Americans. Ultimately, though, McCarthy did not win the nomination. That went to Vice President Hubert Humphrey, who then lost to Richard Nixon in the November election. McCarthy remained in the U.S. Senate until 1970. He later ran for president 3 more times, but never again held public office. In 1987, McCarthy wrote a political memoir, a book called Til Now, and when I met him that spring to talk about it, it was the first of several conversations he and I had. Now, for context, in 1987, the Reagan administration was involved in the war in Nicaragua, a conflict which many Americans warned looked a lot like the quagmire of Vietnam. McCarthy talks about that and about the 1988 election, which was still a year and a half away, that would ultimately pit Vice President George H.W. Bush against Democrat Mike Dukakis. In a moment, Eugene McCarthy.
We're about to take a step back and listen to an iconic voice from our recent past. It's one of over 10,000 interviews noted radio personality Bill Thompson did over a 30-year span. We think you'll enjoy it.
So here now, from 1987, Eugene McCarthy.
Why did you write this book when you did?
Well, it's hard to say. I thought it was time to kind of close a chapter in politics and also to establish a base for saying some things I wanted to say about where I think politics, especially the Democratic Party politics, ought to go. So it's 2 things. One, kind of a covering of the past, and I wanted to write about some of the people I've written about, some of the old House members and Senate members. I thought they deserved a little record in print, but primarily it was to lay a base for talking about some things that I think ought to be done.
Of the reviews that I've read of your book so far, whether one agrees with your views or not, all reviewers agree that you do not mince words.
Well, I didn't really think of being particularly outspoken. I thought it played it pretty straight. I was rather complimented, I think, or pleased. Some person, not a reviewer, said to me the other day, I've been reading the book, and it's sort of as though I were talking to you. So I said, well, that's my technique. Now that I've discovered what it is, that's what I was aiming at. But it was a nice, I was pleased to have him say it.
Who are the heroes and who are the villains of Til Now?
Well, I tried to really establish persons within an institutional framework. I think in the 50s, I think the heroes were the institutions, the House of Representatives, and I would say Sam Rayburn because of the way in which he ran it as a Speaker of the House. I really, I don't know whether I tried, but I had in mind to establish the function of institutions in American government and politics. And I think that period of the late 40s and 50s was a period in which the House of Representatives was probably, at least in a classical way, a heroic or well-performing institution. In the Senate, I have a somewhat different view. I don't think the Senate really was designed to be an organized sort of an institution the way the House was. It was rather a place in which, as I say in the book, the view of Wayne Morse, that there should be no inner ring or club in the Senate, even though the press talks about the club, and there was one. It was not a good thing to have in the Senate, and I suppose I'd say Wayne was a hero in that he was probably more than anyone challenged that conception of the Senate.
The press notwithstanding, could Congress function today as it did in the 50s?
Oh, I think it could. I think the House of Representatives would function much better if it were organized along the lines it was organized in the 50s, with fewer committees and subcommittees, and with a greater measure of party discipline and so on, both in the campaign and after.
Your earliest political backing came largely from students. Your 1968 support came a lot from students, but after 1968, students didn't seem to be nearly as active in things. But now some people, notably Abby Hoffman a couple of weeks ago when he was on trial in Massachusetts, said students are coming back. They're starting to be active again. Have you noticed that?
I don't know about the activism. I think it's pretty spotty. I think there's a concern among students, but it's much more difficult to demonstrate against militarism and the defense budget, or SDI, than it was to demonstrate against something like the war in Vietnam, and much more difficult to demonstrate, say, relative to affirmative action than it was to demonstrate against clear cases of discrimination such as we had in the 60s, legal discrimination as well as physical discrimination. But I think the interest is there. It's a question of, it's rather general lack of interest in politics that if it can be channeled into sort of issues on which action is possible beyond the demonstration, I think that the voters between 18 and 25, which is supposedly the most indifferent one, could respond. They're going to have to pretty soon, because if we continue the Reagan policy of laying the burden of the debt on the generation after the next, they'll have to begin to worry about how they're going to pay it.
It strikes me, though, that if they are active about anything, they are active about things more along the lines of Nicaragua and Central America than about the future debt. Now, let me ask you, is there a parallel that can be drawn between what we're doing in Central America and what we did in Vietnam?
I think there is, in terms of procedure, although I don't believe it can't go to the extremes, first of all, because of the geography. And secondly, I think the experience in Vietnam, although that was an Asian experience and it was an action against which we've been warned by generals like Maxwell Taylor and even General McCarthy, who said don't get involved in a ground war in Asia. So that circumstance is different. But I think also that it may be one of the few certain things that came out of the opposition to the war in Vietnam. I think any administration has got to go pretty carefully now, and he can't assume that there's going to be popular support for a war once it started.
I'm sure you, though, see and hear the same lawmakers that I see and hear saying, well, this is what we're doing in Nicaragua, and look, we did this same thing 25 years ago, and look where it got us in Vietnam.
Well, I think some of the steps, as I say, they're not substantively serious because of other circumstances, but the limited engagement, the advisors that talk about sending in people to protect the advisors, the attempt to get allies into it, they must have a guidebook of the Pentagon somewhere. When they get to a situation, they pull it out, one of those contingency plans that was drafted by McNamara, probably, and they say, lay it on Nicaragua and see if it works.
You don't sound like you're terribly pleased with our policy in Central America at the moment.
Well, it's so negative. I mean, you might, on the facts, make a kind of case maybe for some of the contra actions, but there's no... I was at an economic conference in Honduras, and we're talking about $45 million in aid to various countries, and cutting that by 10 or 15. If there were an overall program like what the Alliance for Progress was expected to be under Kennedy, and the old .4 program, which never really got started, then you could find perhaps some kind of limited justification for some of these military actions, but its military action becomes pretty much the substance of our whole policy.
It occurs to me that 1/3 or more of the country wasn't even born when you ran for president.
Yes, 20 years ago. That's about right. Yes.
Do you? I want to word this diplomatically. Have you become the answer to a trivia question? Do people ask whatever became of Eugene McCarthy?
Well, I know there's a point in politics when you're glad to be included in trivia. So I've made it to the New York Times crossword puzzle. I said that's a significant achievement. I guess the same would be true of trivia. I guess being in trivia on the way up, so to speak, is good. If you're in it on the way down, why, it's probably undesirable. And I don't know just what my status is. You get to thinking you maybe like the concept they had of the Edsel, which was it was supposed to be a car where you could buy when you were on the way up, but weren't sure you were going to make it, and on the way down, and didn't want anyone to know it, and where you could sort of stop if you'd given up. So that may be the case of inclusion in the trivia test now. Well, I don't know. It's hard to. Well, I haven't tried that hard, but even with trying, it's very difficult to stay in the public mind in this country, because of the distraction and the multiplicity of appeals and so on.
I think for historians, you hold quite an important place in our history, though.
I expect Walter Cronkite will be trivia soon. And he's only been out, off the evening news, 5 years? Walter Cronkite. I find on campus that people are a little vague about Walter, Like you said, who was the most trusted man in America 5 years ago? I don't think many would know.
You, I'm sure, have been asked this a zillion times, but I must ask once again, for my own edification as well as others, what happened in 1968? What went wrong?
Well, a lot went right. It becomes a question of what standards you set. If you said, I didn't get nominated and didn't get elected, that was far beyond anything that we anticipated when the campaign was started. If you say, well, did you have an effect? Did you get a public judgment on the issue of the war? You'd have to say we did, and that was a measurable achievement. Then you get into the other things of Robert Kennedy's coming in and Johnson's pulling out, which set up a whole new, not really a framework, but it sort of changed all the projections of the campaign. And as I said, I don't think anyone had ever been tested the way I had. I went around the track once against Lyndon and won that. I went round then against Robert Kennedy, and that was a tie, and then we had to run against the party. So it was the third time around the track, and they had to die different opponents every time we went around. It was like a pen relay or something. And each time, and we finally, we didn't really have time to mount a campaign against the party because all the non-primary political action was over by the time we finished the primaries. So under the circumstances, it's relative, but I think we did have a measure of success, but I'm not sure what the war might have ended just about the way it did, just out of failure, even if we hadn't challenged it. But it was important, I think, to pass a moral judgment on it, as some of the American people wanted to do, and as they did.
As you see it from your vantage point, how does the 1988 race shape up?
Well, I talk about, to some extent in the book, not about the race exactly, but the condition of the party in contrast with, say, in 48, when we had a pretty solid party platform before we had a candidate, really. And that now, instead of that, you have almost every person who announces a candidacy declaring he's going to have new ideas and different ideas, and in the hope, I guess, that they'll shake out something that will get enough support within the party to get the nomination, and beyond that to get elected. But I'd say it borders on being chaotic, the state of the Democratic Party. And that's a very serious condition, because traditionally, and I think we're looking at 40 years, any real initiatives in American government policy have come through the Democratic Party. The fight on civil rights, for example, which could have been a Republican issue because the Republicans didn't have a real anti-civil rights constituency as the Democrats had, yet they did nothing. They hung back and were forced into it after the Democrats took the step.
Do you think there would be more chaos next year than there would be in 1976 when Jimmy Carter emerged?
Well, yeah, the Carter election was almost entirely on negatives. I mean, he ran against the Republicans, of course, Gerald Ford, but he also ran against the Democrats. He was going to do away with bureaucracy, not just particular ones, but it's like when you say that, well, you're doing away with the instrumentation of the New Deal, really, and he attacked the so-called welfare mess, which is always a Republican attack on the Democrats. He said our foreign policy was made in Washington and not among the people. The income tax, which I helped to write, he said was a disgrace to the human race. So you take all the major areas of what I'd say demagoguery, the things that the Republicans run on, and those that the Democrats run on, he used them all, and was kind of elected, I think, by default.
Is there anything else that you wanted to add?
Oh, I don't think so. I don't want to plug the book, but it is a good book, and I think it makes a reasonably good. I got a letter from someone the other day who said, I think reading from whatever pages he said, 238 to 270 should be required reading. He said for every potential voter. I don't remember quite what falls between those pages or on those pages, but I think it's a product of some 30 or 40 years of participating and looking at politics, and almost by accident, you're supposed to, you should winnow something out of that experience, I think, that has application.
Eugene McCarthy died in 2005 at age 89. Now you can get your copy of Up Till Now by Eugene McCarthy by tapping the link in our show notes, by clicking the link in the description below if you're listening to this on YouTube, or by going to our website, heardeverything.com. We may earn an Amazon commission if you make a purchase. HeardEverything.com is where you can also hear my 2004 conversation with the 1972 Democratic nominee, George McGovern.
Liberalism, to me, means a faith that the federal government should take constructive, positive steps to advance the interests of the ordinary rank-and-file American.
And my 1998 conversation with the first woman to be on a major party presidential ticket, 1984's vice presidential nominee Geraldine Ferraro.
What I looked at, it was not only all these people screaming and there was such joy, but I was also looking at tears rolling down people's faces, including some of the women reporters.
And of course, we post new episodes of Now I've Heard Everything every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. And you can find us everywhere you listen to podcasts. And thank you so much for listening. Next time on Now I've Heard Everything, the amazing recollections of a woman who at age 20 was recruited by the OSS, the precursor to the CIA, and became a very successful spy during World War II. My 1988 conversation with Aline, Countess of Romanones.
I was 20 years old when I began, but even then, the United States government did not ask their spies to seduce men. In fact, if we were found to have any romantic attachments, we would immediately be retired from our mission.
That's next time on Now I've Heard Everything. I'm Bill Thompson.